so Yuda can come up front. Welcome, everyone, to the 2020 Leslie G. Rood Memorial Lecture. I am Laurel Elder, Professor of Political Science here at Hartwick College, and I'm so glad that many of you could join us this evening. It looks like we have Hartwick students, we have staff, faculty, and administrators, as well as guests from the community. And to all of you, I say welcome and thank you for sharing your evening with us tonight. As you know, there's an exciting and in many ways historic presidential nomination contest going on. Presidential nominations are an interesting, complicated, and important part of our democracy that only happens once every 4 years. And so we are so fortunate to have a leading national expert on presidential primaries here with us this evening to share her insights on the process with us. Before I introduce our guest speaker, however, I would like to ask President of Hartwick College, Margaret Drugovich, to join me at the podium to share with you all information about the origins of the Leslie G. Rood Memorial Lecture Series.
Thank you, Professor Elder. I want to also acknowledge that Caitlin's parents are here. What a beautiful moment it is to see your child do what they do best, teaching and learning. So welcome to the Leslie G. Memorial Lecture. This is an annual lecture, as Professor Elder noted. Tonight we consider the intersection of democracy and politics and the complex process by which we identify our candidates for one of the world's most influential political leadership roles. This is a discussion that Leslie G. Rood and his colleague, Dr. Norma Hutman, would have encouraged because it examines the process by which we intentionally create and negotiate political processes created to assure a public good. Leslie G. Rood was a Hartwick College faculty member. He was the Vice President of Academic Affairs and Dean of the college. He was passionately committed to every citizen's obligation to participate in the democratic process. In 1998, his colleague, Dr. Norma L. Hutman, established the Leslie G. Rood Memorial Lecture Series to honor Dr. Rood's memory. In celebrating Leslie Rood, Norma Hutman made a statement about the importance of intellectual engagement. She endowed support for this lecture so that she might, quote, participate forever in the educating of Hartwick students, end quote, by providing us the opportunity to learn from a prominent speaker who would expand and enhance our view of the world. Tonight we honor the memory of both Dr. Rood and Dr. Hutman by welcoming a daughter of Hartwick College, Dr. Caitlin E. Jewitt, Hartwick class of 2006, back to our campus to deliver the Leslie G. Rood Memorial Lecture. Thank you for wanting to be part of this important discussion. I now invite Professor Elder to return to the lectern to introduce Dr. Jewitt. Thank you.
Thank you, President Drugovich. First, let me mention a couple of logistics. One is that following Professor Jewitt's talk, there will be time for questions from all of you. So Joanna and Tim will have microphones for you to use so we can all hear your questions. And after the question and answer session, we will have an informal reception. And I will say there's a lot of food and drinks back there, so please do not wait until the reception to enjoy them. Feel free to get up and get a snack or drink. We want you to enjoy yourselves while you're here. And I would also say that even though we did not plan this, it turns out that the first Democratic debate of 2020 is this evening, 9 to 11, live from Iowa. So we welcome all of you to stay and watch part or all of the debate with us. We'll be bringing in even more food, lots of debate watching food, pizza, drinks, cheese sticks, all the essentials of debate watching around 8:30. And the debate will be shown here starting at 9. And I think taking in political events as a community where you can react together and discuss not only enhances democratic engagement, but is definitely the most fun way to watch a debate. Now on to my introduction. So about 16 years ago, my dear friend and colleague Andrew Seligson and I brought a group of 20 Hartwick students to New Hampshire during our 2004 J term, and we had them all volunteer on a presidential campaign of their choice. So we all moved into the Comfort Inn in Manchester, New Hampshire. along with Juan Williams. He was at NPR at the time. Some of you may know him. We spotted him in the lobby frequently. Let's see, we had one student volunteer for George W. Bush, who was running for re-election. 10 students volunteered for Howard Dean, who was the most popular candidate at the time. And all in all, we had an amazing time in New Hampshire. We got to hear from John Kerry and John Edwards in spaces smaller than this room. We got to take pictures with Dennis Kucinich in diners. We got to shake hands with General Wesley Clark. Everyone commented afterwards how remarkably soft his hands were, which was something I still remember. And our speaker, Dr. Jewitt, actually chose to work for Dick Gephardt. Spoiler, he did not win the nomination. So I think it's a testament to the transformative power of Hartwick J-term experiences and a Hartwick education overall that Dr. Jewitt went from this J-term experience on to get her Ph.D. in political science at the University of Minnesota, focusing her dissertation research on presidential nomination contests. She's now a professor of political science at Virginia Tech and just published a book, The Primary Roles, Parties, Voters, and Presidential Nominations with University of Michigan Press, which is the very top press in political science. She has become one of the leading experts on presidential nomination contests. She's been cited in national news articles and is featured in a new podcast just launched by 538 titled The Primary Project, which I highly recommend. Caitlin was an amazing student while at Hartwick, engaged, brilliant, hardworking, but what really stood out to me was that she was also a true political scientist. She was not so much interested in sharing her personal views on issues, but rather using theories and empirical data to understand why political phenomena happen. And indeed, that is what she does in her many publications, including her most recent book. She gathered a lot of data for this research project, and she draws on that data to make very interesting insights about the presidential nomination process. And these insights, I think, are not just interesting to those of us who are political scientists, but they're important to all of us who are living in a democracy where we choose our presidential candidates through this presidential nomination process. So it is with tremendous pride and gratitude that I welcome my former student, Dr. Caitlin Jewitt, to the podium.
It is such an incredible honor to be here tonight, and as Dr. Elder alluded to, it all started for me about 16 years ago this month, and at that time I never would have guessed that I would have been back here doing this and getting to share insights into this topic that I am so passionate about. And one of the things that really inspired me to start studying the presidential nomination process was that when we were in New Hampshire, we were living and breathing the presidential nomination process. And then we returned to New York, and people didn't seem to know that there was a primary going on. And so that stark contrast got me thinking about why is it so different for voters in New Hampshire than for voters in New York. And it's really that insight that has inspired my work and my research in trying to explain the complicated presidential nomination system and the consequences of that system for voters and for who becomes the nominee. And so I want to talk about that tonight. And if you or anyone was tasked with creating a system to select who would become our presidential nominees, I can guarantee that you would not come up with the system we have today. I can guarantee it because our system is complicated and convoluted. It looks different for Democrats and Republicans. It looks different in 2020 than it did in 2016, which looked different than it did in 2012, and so on. If you live in Iowa or New Hampshire, you experience a much different electoral context than if you live in Minnesota or Montana or New York. The system prioritizes and overemphasizes what happens in 2 small, rural, predominantly white states. Some years, the nomination stretches on for months without us having a clear sense of who will be the nominee, and most states get to weigh in when the nomination is still competitive. And in other years, it becomes very clear early on who will become the nominee. The constants in the presidential nomination system are complexity and change. But beyond the complexity, I'm confident that no one would design the system we have today because it wasn't created intentionally or holistically. It was created piecemeal over a lengthy period of time. The national parties, state parties, states, campaigns, candidates, and influential party elites have all dabbled in determining the system we have today over the course of decades. And then they tinkered with it, and then they reworked it, and then they revised it. So before we go any further, I want to briefly outline what I'm going to talk about tonight. First, I want to discuss how we got to our current nomination system and discuss the extent to which it is democratic. And when I say democratic, I'm referring to small d, democratic, in the democracy sense, not in the Democratic Party sense, even though I will be focusing on that tonight because, of course, the Democrats have the competitive presidential nomination in 2020. Once I provide an overview of the current system to make sure everybody is on the same page with how it works, I will discuss some of the electoral rules that contribute to the complexity and some of the consequences of this complexity. Doing so will shed light on just how democratic the process is and just how much influence voters have in the selection of who becomes the nominee. It will also provide a lens through which we can begin to understand what's going on in 2020, some of the dynamics that are already occurring, and some of the dynamics that are likely to occur. And so we really need to start our story at the Democratic National Convention in the summer of 1968. Protests raged in the streets of Chicago, and the National Guard and the police engaged the crowd. Inside the Democratic National Convention Hall, Hubert Humphrey, the vice president at the time, who was certain to continue President Lyndon Johnson's Vietnam War policies, was nominated as the Democratic presidential candidate. Humphrey was not the choice of voters. He could not have been. He did not participate in a single presidential primary. He was the choice of party elites, of the delegates. And to heal this fracture that broke open in the summer of 1968, the Democratic Party created the McGovern-Fraser Commission to study the presidential nomination process and make recommendations for change. One of its stated goals was to provide timely and meaningful participation to voters and to strengthen the link between the preferences of voters expressed at primaries and caucuses with what happened and who was nominated at the National Convention. But the Democratic Party did not stop with the McGovern-Fraser Commission and held several more commissions throughout the 1970s and 1980s. The Republicans became more active in creating commissions and tinkering with the rules in the 1990s and 2000s. All of these commissions were often a reaction to what happened in the last nomination or the last election. For instance, after being unhappy with Carter's nomination, the Democratic Party formed a commission which ultimately created superdelegates, which were delegate slots reserved and are still reserved for party elites and elected officials who did not need to follow the will of the people. This was the Democratic Party's attempt to insert what they called peer review into the process, to say we want voters to decide, but we want to make sure the party decides as well and has a say in this. And so the introduction of superdelegates is just one instance with the Democratic Party tinkering with the rules and tipping the scales of power between voters and elites and trying to come up with that just right balance in the party's minds. And so later on, I will discuss how the Democrats have reacted to 2016 and what that means for superdelegates in 2020, which have become an issue of contention once again. But one of the goals of the McGovern-Fraser Commission was to take the nomination power out of the hands of party elites who were making the decision in so-called smoke-filled rooms behind closed doors and pass that selection power to voters. And it undoubtedly did that. The nomination process is more democratic than it has ever been. Voter preferences and votes matter. The results of the primaries and caucuses influence what happens at the convention and who is nominated. Yet my research focuses on motivating questions of how democratic is the system really? Do people choose the nominees? What is the role of parties in the process? I argue that the parties still retain enormous influence. I argue in my work that the parties have not turned the selection power solely over to voters, but instead exert their power and influence in other, now more subtle ways. And one of those ways is through the electoral rules. The parties also retain influence in other ways, such as through debate rules and their power to endorse candidates, but I really focus in my work on the electoral rules. And the rules matter. They affect meaningful participation. And when I refer to meaningful participation, I am at the most basic level referring to whether voters have the opportunity to voice a preference when the outcome is still uncertain. So whether voters have a say when the nomination is still competitive and there is still a choice to be made. It is feasible this year in 2020 that the nomination could be decided sometime in March or early April. The New York primary will be April 28th. It is possible that voters in New York will go to the polls after we already know who the Democratic nominee will be. I will argue that in that instance, if that were to occur, New York voters would not have meaningful participation, that they have no say in who becomes the Democratic nominee. And the rules affect the extent to which voters' voices and preferences influence which candidate becomes the nominee. The rules determine whether or not voters have a say. And so the broad outline of the presidential nomination system in the US is that voters participate in primaries and caucuses over the course of several months, typically February through June. Much like the presidential general election, where voters are not actually voting for a presidential candidate, but are selecting electors who go on to the Electoral College to officially elect a president, the nomination process is also a two-step process. In the primaries and caucuses, voters are actually selecting delegates who will vote and select a nominee at the national conventions held over the summer. And a candidate does not officially become the nominee until he or she receives a majority of votes from delegates at the national convention. Now, the basics of the system are further complicated by the many actors that have a role in determining the details of the presidential nomination process. The National Democratic and National Republican parties can and do have different rules governing the system, though there is some coordination between the parties. For instance, for decades, the Democratic Party has required that delegates be awarded proportionally to candidates based on the results in the primary or the caucus. Only recently, since 2012, has the National Republican Party mandated that the states use a certain delegate allocation rule. And so as long as states abide by the national party guidelines, the states and state parties can set their own rules within these confines. For instance, neither national party has ever dictated whether primaries or caucuses must be used. So states are free to choose. We've seen a trend in the aggregate away from caucuses and toward primaries. States and state parties also, as I mentioned, have some say in how they allocate delegates to the National Convention. There is much less flexibility on the Democratic side. The states can also decide who can participate. So are opposite party members and independents allowed to participate? In New York, there is a closed primary. I spoke with someone earlier today who is a registered independent and therefore is not permitted to vote in either the Republican or the Democratic primary. Only registered Democrats can participate in the Democratic primary, and only registered Republicans can participate in the Republican primary. I live in Virginia, and we do not have party registration. So you show up on primary day, and they say, do you want a Democratic ballot or a Republican ballot? And they hand you the one that you ask for, and you can ask for a different one from year to year. States also have some say in the date of their primary and caucus. And with the national parties setting some broad guidelines that may be different from one another, and the states and state parties also determining exactly what the presidential nominating contest will look like within the state, the result is a very complex, constantly changing system that can be hard to understand and decipher. And so to illustrate some of this complexity, I have a few different examples. In Montana in 2008, the Republican Party held a caucus on February 5th where only Republicans were allowed to participate. The Republican delegates from Montana were allocated in a winner-take-all fashion to the candidate that received the highest vote total. The Democratic Party in Montana held a primary on June 3rd, 2008, nearly 4 months after the Republican caucuses. Republicans who had not participated in the Republican caucus, independents, and Democrats were all permitted to participate in the Democratic primary. Rather than allocate all of the delegates to the winning candidate, as the Republicans did, the Democratic Party in Montana split the delegates proportionally between the candidates based on how well each did in the state. Democrats and Republicans in Montana in 2008 experienced completely different electoral contexts. Even within the same party in the same election year, there are considerable differences across states. So using the 2016 Republicans as an example, in Iowa, they held a caucus on February 1st, 2016. It was closed to registered Republicans. They used proportional representation to allocate the delegates, and voters in Iowa chose between 11 candidates. The nomination was undoubtedly competitive at this point in the nomination season. And Iowan Republicans turned out at a rate of about 15%. 1 month later, Republican voters in Virginia headed to the polls, to the primary election that was held on March 1st. This, as I mentioned, in Virginia is open to any voter that chose to participate, though you cannot participate in the Republican and Democratic primary. You have to choose one ballot. This also used proportional representation, but at this point there were only 5 candidates in the race. So the field had narrowed considerably, though it was still competitive. In Virginia, there was a 35% turnout rate. In 2016, New York held a primary on April 19th. This was closed to registered Republicans. They used a conditional delegate allocation rule, which meant that if any candidate received 50% of the vote, he or she received all of the Republican delegates, but if no candidate received 50% of the vote, then they allocated the delegates proportionally. There were only 3 candidates, Cruz, Kasich, and Trump, left in the nomination at this stage, but it was still competitive and had a 19% turnout rate. New Jersey held a primary on June 7th that was semi-open, and so it was open to Republicans and independents, but Democrats were excluded from participating. They allocated all of their delegates to the winner, which wasn't a problem because there was only one candidate left in the race. And we knew at this point that Donald Trump would be the nominee. New Jersey voters, there was a 7% turnout rate. There's not much incentive to turn out for an election when you already know what the outcome will be. But I argue that voters in New Jersey didn't have any meaningful participation in the outcome of the Republican nomination. Trump was already the Republican nominee. And though there are differences within a state across parties, and across states in a single election year, the system can also be complicated for voters of a single party who remain in their state over time. And you can imagine that this can discourage participation if the rules of the game are always changing. So Republicans in Nevada are constantly exposed to different circumstances surrounding their nomination contest. Over the past 3 nominating contests in Nevada, Republicans have caucused twice, held 1 primary, voted in mid-January, early February, and late February, and also experienced different delegate allocation rules. In 2020, Nevada Republicans will not participate in a primary or a caucus, as Nevada has opted not to hold a contest and will pledge all of its delegates to President Trump. And I argue that it's important that we recognize this complexity and understand that voters are exposed to different electoral systems and contexts, but it's also critical that we understand that these electoral rules put in place by national parties, states, and influential political elites, that these rules have consequences. They have consequences for the extent to which voters have the opportunity to participate in a meaningful way and for which candidates are successful. They influence the extent to which we could consider the process democratic. This graph shows in the left panel that under the delegate allocation rules that the Democrats used in 2008, Obama had more delegates than Clinton. However, if nothing changed, so the candidates didn't alter their strategies and voters cast the same ballots, but the Democrats had used winner-take-all to allocate delegates, based on the results of the primaries and the caucuses, Clinton would have secured more delegates than Obama. In other words, the electoral rules, the way we count votes, matters. We know this to be true in the case of the Electoral College, that the popular vote and the Electoral College at times can give us divergent results. But this happens quite frequently in presidential nominations, and yet it typically goes unnoticed. Perhaps because the delegate allocation rules remain a mystery to so many. We also see that as a result of the rules, whether a state holds a primary or a caucus, whether or not independents and opposite party members are allowed to participate, and whether or not the nomination is still competitive, that the number of voters turning out varies dramatically. And so this graph shows turnout across states for the 2016 Republicans. In the 2016 Republican nomination contest, turnout ranged from less than 1% in Wyoming to almost 60% in New Hampshire. And so it's vital that we understand the rules surrounding the calendar, and it not only explains some of this variation in voter turnout, as this graph depicts, but also contributes significantly to the extent to which voters have meaningful participation and for which candidates are likely to be successful. And understanding the calendar will be useful to anticipating how the 2020 nomination will unfold. National parties set rules about when states can schedule their contests, and 4 states, often referred to as the early carve-out states, are allowed to vote first. Iowa and New Hampshire go first because it's tradition, right? There's a larger story behind this, but there's really no good reason for why Iowa and New Hampshire go first. And the voters of Iowa and New Hampshire are not representative of the American public. They are both small, rural states that are predominantly white. And they're also not representative of the Democratic Party. And I'll discuss some of the implications of this for 2020 shortly. And so in 2008, the Democratic National Committee wanted to add racial and regional diversity to the calendar. So Nevada and South Carolina were scheduled early on the calendar and have remained in that early time period since. In recent years, other states are allowed to start scheduling their contests in March, when the window opens. And typically the first Tuesday when all other states schedule their contest is known as Super Tuesday, because of the large number of states that have flocked to this date, trying to attain influence and prestige and money from the candidates in the nomination race. And in recent nominations, we have seen an increase in front-loading. Front-loading is the trend in which states schedule their contests early on in the nomination season instead of spreading evenly across the season or clustering toward the end. And you can see evidence of front-loading here when comparing the 2020 Democratic calendar to the 1980 Democratic calendar. So the x-axis is the number of days between the first contest, Iowa, and each individual contest in the state. So at 0, this is the Iowa caucuses, and this is the Iowa caucuses here. The closer we are to the left-hand side of the graph, the more front-loaded, or the earlier in the calendar it is. As you can see here in 2020, this very tall bar is Super Tuesday. 14 states will vote on Super Tuesday 2020, 29 days after Iowa. There are certainly a few more popular dates in the 1980 calendar, but not to the extent of Super Tuesday in 2020. Now, the national parties would prefer a slower buildup. They prefer a non-front-loaded calendar, and they have taken steps, though they have been largely ineffective, to try and achieve their preferred calendar, but states have an incentive to front-load, to move their contests early on in the season. And the calendar and the level of front-loading have important consequences for how the nomination season takes shape. As I mentioned earlier, a candidate officially becomes the nominee when he or she receives a majority of votes from delegates at the National Convention. But in practice, a candidate can become the presumptive nominee through one of two ways: by securing a majority of delegates, or because all of their major competitors withdraw from the race. What this means is that we often know who will be the nominee long before it becomes official at the National Convention, because competitors often withdraw even before a candidate gets 50%. They don't wait for their competitor to secure 50%. They often see the writing on the wall and withdraw from the race. It also means that sometimes the nomination is decided before all states get to vote. In the 2000 Republican race, George Bush became the presumptive nominee on March 4th, as all of his major competitors had withdrawn from the race. This was 45 days after the nomination season had begun. 23 states had voted at this point in the nomination. Republican voters in the other 27 states had no meaningful participation, as the nomination was decided before they went to the polls. Now, some states, Iowa and New Hampshire, always matter and shape which candidates drop out of the race and which candidates are propelled to frontrunner status. Some states matter sometimes. In 2008, we saw Pennsylvania matter immensely in the Democratic race because it happened in May. Obama and Clinton were still neck and neck. There was a long period of time before the Pennsylvania primary in which there were no other contests scheduled. So Obama and Clinton were focusing their efforts on Pennsylvania, and media attention was there as well. Some states rarely matter because they vote at the end of the nomination season or have relatively few delegates associated with them. And these voters hardly ever have meaningful participation or get to help determine who becomes the nominee. In 2016, Super Tuesday was referred to in the media as the SEC primary because so many southern states were holding their contests. Once it became clear that Trump was the delegate leader, there was discussion about whether Cruz could catch up and overtake him. However, the sequence of states made that virtually impossible because the states that were left, non-southern states, mostly northeastern states like New York and Pennsylvania, but also other states like California, were not states where Cruz was strong. The southern states had already voted. And front-loaded calendars also advantage candidates that are well-known and can raise large amounts of money. It takes a strong campaign organization to be able to compete in more than a dozen states simultaneously on Super Tuesday. It used to be the case that the nomination calendar built slowly, and a dark horse candidate, like Jimmy Carter, could use a success in one state to build momentum and propel himself to the nomination. Given the configuration of recent calendars, that momentum strategy is becoming increasingly untenable. In order to succeed in a front-loaded calendar, a candidate has to head into the nomination with strong front-running, strong financing, national recognition, and a sophisticated, well-run campaign organization. So as we turn our attention to 2020, we must look back to 2016. Following the 2016 nomination, the Democratic Party faced protests from Sanders supporters, claims that they had rigged the nomination for Hillary Clinton, and outrage over superdelegates and their role in the process. So the party did what it knows how to do. It created a commission to study the presidential nomination process and suggest reforms. It was the Unity Reform Commission. As evidenced by its name, the goal was to unite the party and to heal divisions that emerged in 2016 and to try and bring Sanders supporters back into the fold of the Democratic Party. As a result of the Unity Reform Commission, in 2020, superdelegates, the elected officials and party leaders who have delegate slots but who are not bound or pledged to the results of the primaries and caucuses, will only be allowed to vote on the first ballot if their votes will not be decisive. If they could change the outcome of the nomination, they will not be permitted to vote until the second ballot. In other words, the Democratic Party is appearing to reduce the influence of party elites and give more power to voters. And largely in response to claims that there were not enough debates between Clinton and Sanders in 2016, and the debates that were held at less than ideal times, the Democratic Party also became active in setting the rules for debate for the 2020 nomination. They have done so by determining the number of debates, 12, and by determining the qualifications for a candidate to make the debate stage, namely through polling and fundraising thresholds. Though the Democratic Party has been transparent about the debate rules, this is nonetheless the party exerting its influence through the debate rules. The increasing qualification thresholds means that the party is trying to winnow or narrow the field, making it more difficult for candidates to qualify for the debate stage as we approach Iowa. Cory Booker was on the morning shows this morning arguing that the debate rules contributed to his decision to withdraw from the race. So in 2020, we started with a very large field of candidates. It was extremely diverse, but is becoming increasingly less so with recent withdrawals by Harris, Booker, and Castro. One of the reasons that there's a large field in 2020 is that it looks feasible for a Democrat to win the general election in November. Trump's nomination in 2016 also contributed to the idea, even among elites, that anyone, a businessman who'd never held elected office, or a small-town mayor from Indiana, could become the nominee and go on to win the nomination. Despite the number of candidates, we can fairly safely consider the top tier of candidates at this point to be Biden, Sanders, Warren, and Buttigieg. And that's probably the correct order in the terms of placing them in terms of their likelihood of capturing the nomination. Some argue that we can think of Biden in his own tier, with Sanders below him, and then Warren used to be in Sanders' tier, but perhaps has fallen down more in line with Buttigieg in recent weeks. Biden is probably the front runner at this point and the most likely to become the nominee, but it's not at all certain. And I would not be surprised if any of these candidates ended up as the Democratic nominee in 2020. Biden is supported by the establishment, the Democratic Party establishment, more than any of the other candidates, but elites have been notably slow to endorse this year. Relatively few elites have endorsed a candidate, and those that have endorsed are not solidified around a single candidate. And this is distinct from how the Democrats looked in 2016 with overwhelming party support for Clinton. This scenario more closely mirrors the 2016 Republican nomination, where there were a large number of Republican candidates, no clear frontrunner, and elites were divided. And it is that scenario that created an opening in 2016 for Donald Trump, an extremely unlikely victor, to capture the nomination. It's also important to note that Sanders has been the best fundraiser among the Democratic candidates, and this has traditionally been a strong predictor of who will be successful in the presidential nomination. So we know in 2020 that the rules will matter. They will influence which candidate is successful and the extent to which voters have a meaningful say in the outcome. When thinking about how the Democratic nomination in 2020 will transpire, it's important to keep in mind that the Democratic rules mandate proportional representation with a 15% threshold. That means that a candidate that captures 14% of the vote will receive no delegates. Any candidate that receives over 15% of the vote will be eligible for a share of the delegates. That means that candidates will split the delegates across the states. This makes it more difficult to get a majority of delegates. And the calendar and order in which the states vote matter, particularly given this diverse set of candidates. When talking about the order and the sequence, it's important that we also consider the debate tonight. The debate tonight is the last debate before Iowa. And this is important because many Iowa voters are still making up their minds. Iowans are known for making up their minds late. In a recently released Iowa poll, only 40% of likely caucus goers said their mind was made up. There will also be the fewest candidates on stage to date, as only 6 candidates qualified for the debate. So in less than 3 weeks, Iowa voters will head to their caucus locations. 538, a political news site that relies heavily on empirical political science analysis, has odds slightly in favor of Biden winning Iowa, but a new poll in Iowa shows Sanders with a lead. In a new Iowa poll that was released on Thursday, the first poll in Iowa to be released in the past 2 months, showed Sanders polling at 20%, Warren at 17%, Buttigieg at 16%, and Biden at 15%. The margin of error for this poll was 3.7%. This looks like the first time in Iowa history that 4 candidates could surpass the 15% threshold and capture delegates. Just this morning, however, I saw reference to another poll that showed Biden ahead of Sanders in Iowa. So that means at this point, Iowa is up for grabs. And tonight's debate matters, especially for what happens in Iowa. And so among the carve-out states, these 4 states that vote early, Iowa is also the place where Buttigieg is expected to perform the best. If he does worse than expected in Iowa, I would expect that we will see his campaign falter. He needs to prove that he can win big in a state where he's expected to do well if he wants any chance in states where he's not as popular and among demographics that are less sold on him. Iowa has never been about the delegate prize, though. It has relatively few delegates, 41 pledged delegates, out of over 4,000 Democratic delegates. It's more important in the momentum race, for the candidate that receives a bounce in the polls from the favorable media coverage. The results of Iowa shape the trajectory of the race. And for that reason, the media narrative coming out of Iowa will be important. Will the media describe one candidate as winning, or will they talk about it having been a close race and the delegates that are split amongst the candidates? It's important because 8 days after Iowa, New Hampshire voters go to the polls. Sanders is expected to do well in New Hampshire as he appeals to the more progressive, liberal wing of the Democratic Party and is from neighboring Vermont. Warren, for these reasons, should also perform well in New Hampshire, since her home is also the Northeast. And unless the results of Iowa and New Hampshire really shake things up, Nevada and South Carolina look to be the most favorable to Biden. Nevada is a majority non-white state, and South Carolina has the largest number of African Americans among any of the carve-out states, and Biden has the most support among this demographic. It would not at all be surprising for Biden to win both of these states. Almost 40% of Democratic delegates will be awarded on Super Tuesday. But again, they will be split between multiple candidates because of the proportional representation rules. And the states that are voting on Super Tuesday in 2020 are diverse, much more diverse than the states that voted in the Super Tuesday SEC primary in 2016. California, notably, has moved up to Super Tuesday in 2020, and Kamala Harris's withdrawal from the race opens up this delegate prize. This gives you an idea of how the results of one contest shape the course of the race. The presidential nomination process is a sequential process. Iowa shapes New Hampshire, which shapes Nevada, which shapes South Carolina, which shapes Super Tuesday. You can imagine that if Nevada and South Carolina voted first, that different candidates would look strong and the race may play out differently. I recognize that you probably want me to make predictions about who will win the Democratic nomination. I'm not going to do that, particularly because I went on record 4 years ago stating that there was no way that Donald Trump would become the Republican nominee, and so I've learned my lesson. I will go on record and say I'm very confident that the length and trajectory of the race will be shaped by what happens in February, when the first 4 states vote. It's possible that the early carve-out states will all render different decisions and not come to a consensus, and all of the candidates will dig in. No one will withdraw from the race. If that happens, we will head into Super Tuesday without a clear frontrunner, and the nomination race will be considerably more chaotic. If one candidate wins all 4, or even 3 out of 4 of the early states, that candidate will emerge as the frontrunner. And I expect the other top-tier candidates to withdraw from the race, or I should say some of the other top-tier candidates to withdraw from the race. The question in my mind is what Bernie Sanders will do. I don't know if he's a candidate that we can expect to withdraw. Sanders and Warren have the most overlap in voters among the top 4 candidates, and so the longer they both stay in the race, the more they are hurt. If one of them drops out early, it bolsters the other's chances. And more so this year than in other years, Democratic voters are saying that electability is their most important priority. A majority of likely Democratic primary voters say it's more important that the nominee be able to beat President Trump in November than agree with them on the issues. Thus, we might see a dramatic convergence on a candidate who looks like he or she can put together a coalition and win states. Now, there are already discussions and pronouncements about the possibility of a contested convention, a convention where it takes more than one ballot to nominate a candidate because no candidate has a majority of delegates on the first ballot. It's a possibility, and the proportional representation rules make this more likely because candidates will be splitting the delegates. But one thing to note is that delegates are pledged to the candidate, to support a candidate, but they are not legally bound. A candidate can release his or her delegates and encourage but not compel them to support another candidate. And so you can imagine a scenario, perhaps, where Bernie Sanders would release his delegates and encourage them to support Elizabeth Warren on the first ballot because Sanders would prefer Warren to be the nominee than Joe Biden. And this could happen before the first ballot and could theoretically help a candidate reach a majority of delegates. I would not at this point put the chances too high of a contested convention because the Democrats are prioritizing electability above all else. And the party has an incentive to come to a consensus without it taking multiple ballots. And I will stop there and be happy to take your questions.
We have two people with microphones walking around. Can Joanna or anyone ready? First question.
I'll take one anyway. Is this on? First of all, I admire you having condensed what used to take some of us weeks to share with our students in an hour or less. Secondly, it's always struck me as a singular lack of imagination in this country that we seem unable to consider the possibility that since we're electing the only national leader that matters, that we can't make national rules through the national legislature for this process. The other thing that strikes me is it's also unimaginative for us to decide that a few states, like the carve-out states, always get to go first. And that seems to me singularly unfair to most of the rest of the country. And with that, I'll stop.
Right, and so one thing that I didn't touch on too much here, but just to sort of reiterate that, is that the nominating process is a party-run process, right? It is not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution whatsoever, and the political parties are private organizations and therefore can do what they want and create their own system. And so there is relatively little sort of federal guidance on this for that reason.
Hi, thanks. Great talk. I don't sincerely believe any of what I'm about to say, but if I was going to defend the current system, I think I would do so using at least one of the following 2 or 3 kinds of arguments. So first of all, you say that the current process privileges candidates who can raise a lot of money, have high name ID, and have sophisticated campaign organizations. And it seems to me that part of what we want to do in this primary process is figure out people who can win general elections. And those are all like really good things that primaries ought to prioritize. Kind of dovetailing with that, like related to it, if you move to some system that much like nationalized the process so that potential candidates needed to raise money or needed to run organizations, not just in Iowa and New Hampshire, but now across the whole country, that doesn't solve any of those problems. In fact, it makes it a lot worse.
Exacerbates it.
Right. And then so third and finally, and I guess somewhat related to, your last comment, is why should we think that this process ought to be democratic? I mean, so in other words, you might say, yeah, this is a really anti-democratic process, and it seems to me a perfectly reasonable response to say, right, good. The democracy part comes later when we do the big general election. This is not for democracy.
Yes, and I don't know that I would argue that it should be small d democratic, right? I sort of evaluate it on those criteria because the Democratic Party has said we want to give voters timely and meaningful participation, and we want to engage them and make their preferences matter. And I think Americans believe it to be a democratic system. I think there are many people who are strong partisans who would argue it would be better on some dimensions for party elites to choose the nominee, right? You can imagine that in the 2016 Republican nomination, if Republican elites were choosing the nominee, we don't have President Trump, right? They never would pick Donald Trump out of the potential contenders, right? And so there is very much that argument that elites should have more of a say in this process. And so I'm not necessarily advocating a position and that I think it should be a purely small d democratic process. My work just points out it's not as democratic as everybody thinks.
I'm interested in the party that has the incumbent. You mentioned that Nevada was just going to cancel their primary this year because they were going to go 100% for Donald Trump. Did the same thing happen with Obama in 2012? And is there any protest? Is there any kickback from the voters saying the states are just going to cancel these primaries because we have the incumbent and no one else can possibly challenge the incumbent?
Right, and so I used Nevada as an example, but there are other states also canceling their Republican contests. It is not unheard of, right? This happened in 2012 for Obama. It happens fairly regularly whenever there's an incumbent president running for renomination without any serious contenders. We see states cancel their contests. If states hold a primary, that's expensive. It's expensive to host a primary election. And so states look at it often and say, why are we going to spend all of this money when we know that the outcome is a certainty? Nevada is a little bit of a different example because they have a caucus. And so the state doesn't pay for it. The party pays for the caucus. I think in 2020, this is getting more attention because President Trump's approval ratings are relatively low. There are impeachment is an ongoing process, and so that has sort of drawn more attention to it, but it absolutely happened in 2012 for Obama, and there were maybe a story or two about it, but nobody really took notice. Even though President Trump's approval rating is low overall, it is very high among Republicans, right? And so Nevada Republicans are saying, we are fully in support of President Trump, and so we are just going to pledge all of our delegates to him. And this is one place where influential party elites and candidates can influence the process, and that there is pressure from the Trump campaign for states to do this as a way to keep out challengers. If we don't have a contest, President Trump can't have a competitor emerge. Yeah, so Carter faced challenges, but probably most recently, George H.W. Bush faced a challenge from Pat Buchanan, who was sort of stronger than expected, and they had, in the Bush campaign, had to mount a campaign and sort of compete, and it took them a while to get 50% of the delegates, in large part because the nomination wasn't as front-loaded, but there wasn't in 1992 any real concern that Bush wasn't going to be renominated, but that he sort of had to deal with Buchanan's contesting his nomination.
What's your personal preference? A caucus or a primary, and why?
So I think I am, as Laurel mentioned, Dr. Elder mentioned, very much a political scientist and try to look at things objectively, and so I try not to state my personal preference. I would say it depends on your goals, that primaries by far have higher turnout rates than caucuses, right? So if you are at all concerned about the number of voters participating, a primary is the way to go. My research shows that on average, a primary results in a turnout rate that is 19 percentage points higher than that in a caucus, holding all other factors constant. A caucus, though, is deliberative democracy at its core, right? Where people are getting together and debating ideas and the ability to sort of convince people of your position or of your preferred candidate. From the party perspective, they often prefer or don't mind caucuses because it lets them sort of more tightly control the process, and they know that only die-hard party supporters will turn out, and they won't be sort of infiltrated by people who are just interested in the primary this year.
What, if you know or have studied this, what's the difference in the money component between fundraising for primary candidates and party contribution to a caucus?
Oh, so how much does it cost to run a primary versus a caucus?
What's the difference in effect between those two sources of funding, if any?
I'm not sure I follow your question. So the state
Well,
pays...
the part that money plays in politics is a concern. So does it make a difference whether the funding comes because candidates have raised money or whether the party funds a caucus?
Right, so the state pays for a primary election if a primary is held, and the party is responsible for hosting a caucus. It's sort of hard to separate that out because there are so many other factors going on. But certainly that's an incentive often for states to switch, or for state parties to want to switch to a primary, because then they can pass the costs off to the state versus paying for it themselves. But sometimes the parties are willing to incur this cost. One of my favorite examples is in 2016, Rand Paul was running for the Republican nomination, and Kentucky has a rule that you cannot be on the primary ballot for multiple offices at once. His Senate seat was also up for re-election, and so he and his campaign convinced Kentucky to hold a presidential caucus so that he could be on the ballot in the presidential caucus and then also on the primary ballot for his Senate seat. And there was some deal there in which his campaign would fund some of the cost of the caucus, right? So it's sort of an example of how candidates get involved in this, and that the rules are absolutely manipulated at times to advantage certain candidates.
Real quick, could you speculate on Bloomberg?
Yeah, so Bloomberg is interesting, right? He is not fundraising. He is not, and for that reason, because he's not fundraising, he is not on the debate stage. He is also not competing in the first 4 carve-out states. We have never had a nominee who has, we've had candidates before say, I'm going to ignore Iowa or I'm going to ignore New Hampshire, usually because there's another candidate that is so strong in one of those states that they feel like it doesn't even make sense to spend resources here. We've never had a candidate say, I'm just ignoring the first 4 states. Bloomberg is relying almost solely on a major advertising strategy. I would be surprised if that is effective. We are seeing some reaction to that in the polls in states where that is going on, but you have to question how soft that response in the polls is, and that he might see sort of higher ratings in states where he's advertising right now, but I wouldn't be surprised if that collapses after Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina and Nevada vote and he doesn't get any delegates in any of those states. He's hard to classify because it's certainly not, we don't have a lot of examples of a campaign run like his.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was excellent.
Thank you.
So you started out with the example of 68 in the Democratic Party. And that was, in fact, a pretty competitive primary season.
Yes.
Until June.
Yes.
what do we have in place these days? What does the Democratic Party, in this case this year, the Democratic Party have in place this year should, God forbid, leading candidate drop dead?
So that is why the Democratic delegates are pledged, not bound. So if something happens to a candidate, right, Robert Kennedy was assassinated during the 1968 Democratic primary, actually after winning in California, and I believe it was Wisconsin. He won primaries and was killed that evening. Democratic delegates are pledged, and so they could go to another candidate without needing to sort of vote on the first ballot. So that is what we have in place. Some states bind their delegates, but it appears that national party rules sort of supersede that, though we've never really tested it out in the post-reform era since the Supreme Court case indicated that to be true.
Alrighty, hello. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is you mentioned how there's the Bernie Sanders and the Elizabeth Warren split when it comes to the progressive side of the party. But then also when you kind of see more on the moderate wing, you have Biden, who at first when he announced was polling very high because he was considered more of a moderate. But then you had people like Pete Buttigieg, who's kind of taken away from that, Amy Klobuchar and Michael Bloomberg too. So could you possibly see, maybe if he doesn't do well in New Hampshire, a complete race for the moderate side of the Democratic Party? Or if he does really well, you could see like Buttigieg, Bloomberg, and also Amy Klobuchar collapse and see Biden once again kind of take a higher front-runner status?
Yeah, I think that's a possibility. I think I would still probably put Sanders and Warren closer in ideological space and in the voters that they share than Biden and Buttigieg. I think there's more distinctions there, notably that Biden is very strong among non-whites and Buttigieg is decidedly not strong among non-whites. There's some differences in sort of college-educated versus not, right? But I do think that if Buttigieg withdraws from the race, and I think that if he does not win in New Hampshire and Iowa or do better than expected, sort of a very close second, I would expect him to withdraw earlier on. And I think we would probably see some of that support go to Biden, especially if he were to win Iowa or New Hampshire and sort of become the front runner. I think those more moderate, more establishment Democrats start to rally around him more closely. I'll also take this opportunity just to say that I think the reasons I would sort of expect Buttigieg to withdraw from the race fairly quickly, but I sort of mentioned that I was uncertain about what Sanders will do, is that Buttigieg has a much longer future in the Democratic Party and will undoubtedly be looking to a run in 2024 or 2028, that he's gotten many more opportunities to race with and will not want to anger elites who think he sort of spoiled Biden's chances at the nomination. Sanders, I don't think, is as concerned about that.
Do you think Buttigieg or one of the other candidates, if Buttigieg is to drop out, they would select him as a VP nomination?
I think it's possible, right? So there's sort of all these discussions about VP swirling. I think it's possible. I think the Democrats will, if it's a white man as the nominee, probably feel pressure to select a minority, either in terms of race or gender, as the vice presidential candidate. I would be surprised, but again, I don't like to go on record with these too strongly, if we end up with two white men as presidential and vice presidential candidates, given what the Democratic Party looks like today.
Hey, sorry. I was asking, earlier you said that Elizabeth Warren was seen as like a very good second person that people would want. Do you think that the issue that she currently has with Bernie Sanders regarding a conversation that they had could impact her being a second choice to him, or could lower his chances of doing well tonight?
So do I think this sort of recent scuffle would change the chances that he picks her as a vice presidential candidate?
Yes, because they have so many similar views. Do you think that that would impact him endorsing her, endorsing him?
Yeah, I would say we need to sort of see how long this lasts. I'll be interested to know if it comes up in the debate tonight. I think relatively few people are probably aware of this, I'm trying to think of the right word, this tension between them at this point. If it comes out in the debate tonight, that's sort of more problematic. But candidates certainly do consider who stayed in the race for how long and how much they attacked one another during the nomination season, right? We did not see Obama pick Clinton as his vice presidential candidate. They had just spent months sort of going at each other. So I would say it sort of depends on how long this draws out and what the tone is between them going forward.
Thanks.
You know, every year when we complete our taxes, we get the opportunity to donate. I'm curious about how many Americans do take that opportunity to donate to these, the electoral process. How much money is actually raised, do you know? And it's phenomenally expensive to run these races, so I'm just curious about any thoughts you might have about that as well.
Right. I do not know the exact figures on that, mostly because campaign financing is such a complicated area that I've just tried to stay out of it completely. But I do know that that is public financing program, sort of giving candidates public money. Almost no candidate accepts that money because it requires them to stay within spending limits in each state that are wholly unrealistic given the current nomination and given what other candidates are spending. And so they just spend money that they raise or self-finance their campaigns. No. Where does the money go? Oh, I don't know that I know the answer to that.
So you pointed out that caucuses are a little bit more difficult to deal with than primaries, right? And that essentially that is a more democratic process, but participation rate goes down from the extremely high of, what was it, Montana that had 35%, I think, and you had Iowa at 19 or whatever it was. There's a lot of different ways that we define small d democracy, right? Not just voting. And unfortunately, in our country, if voting is small d democracy, we're pretty much doomed as far from a democratic perspective. Do you, in your book, look at the connection between the primary rules and the way that people participate in primaries and other aspects of democracy, or how those rules and primaries affect the broader sense of democratic participation? Because we have a lot of students here who, from looking at primaries, it would be easy to say, this isn't a democracy, we don't do anything right. But no matter what rules we change, there, like Matt said, there's always going to be other problems that come up. So do you look at that? Do you look at other aspects and then how the primary rules affect that?
Right. In the book, I do not. The book looks at the electoral rules and the impact on the length of time that a nomination lasts, how long it's competitive, how many states vote in the competitive period or not, voter turnout, and then changing the delegate allocation rules, would it change the outcome? So that's what the book focuses on. I do talk a bit about caucuses and sort of highlight some of the strengths of caucuses, these deliberative democracy aspects, contributing to state party platforms and such. I am working on another project. I actually sort of stumbled upon a survey that was given in May of 2016 to voters, and it asked them questions about the nominating processes and how confident they were in the fairness of the Democratic nominating process and the Republican nominating process. And so I look at it a little bit and sort of how are these perceptions shaped? Do people have confidence in it? And it also had questions of like, do you think superdelegates are a very good idea or a somewhat good idea, or primary is more fair than caucuses? And so I get at confidence and public perceptions of that a little bit. I didn't design, develop, and implement the survey, so I'm sort of stuck with the questions there are. But it is one of the only instances I have come across in which we ask voters, what do you think is more fair? Do you have confidence in the outcome of it? And I combine that data with my own data that I collected, and I look at whether voters that vote in a primary or a caucus feel differently and try to match. If they vote in a primary and they think primaries are more fair, do they have more confidence than if they believe primaries are more fair but vote in a caucus state?
This is only half formulated. Being you and the general discourse talks about the party. So there's the voters and the party, but the party is itself some people.
Right.
And so to what extent is the party structure open to interested parties, interested individuals to make their way into it and have a say as an insider rather than just being a run-of-the-mill voter?
Right, extremely open. And that's one of the other themes in the book, is that I argue that the parties have the ability to influence the nomination through the electoral rules. But I also somewhat argue that the parties are doing so very ineffectively because they don't even know, either they don't know what their goals are or they don't agree on their goals. And so they are always reacting to the last nomination and what happened instead of sort of thinking about this holistically and sort of what would be best in the long run. It's like, if our candidate lost in the general election, we're going to change the rules. And then, oh, that didn't work out so well, so we'll change the rules again. But you see this even in the Unity Reform Commission that the Democrats formed between following the 2016 nomination. There was a lot of contention over who they put on that. There were going to be more Clinton supporters than Sanders supporters, but they made sure that there were, like a few more Clinton supporters, but there were plenty of Sanders supporters at the table, but that absolutely sort of influenced the rules and reforms that they adopted.